Well, welcome everybody. Now, border management faces a complex set of challenges today, from evolving geopolitical dynamics to sanctions enforcement, requiring solutions that bridge research and real-world application. The Borders and Globalization Lab connects international scholarship with practical policy through our global network of researchers and cross-border organizations. This webinar advances our mission to strengthen border knowledge excellence and improve management practices in Canada and worldwide. So let's get started. It is my pleasure to introduce Peter Swartz, a pioneer in the application of artificial intelligence to global supply chain security. As co-founder and chief science officer of Altana, Peter has developed groundbreaking systems that provide unprecedented visibility across international trade networks, enabling border agencies and security officials to identify risks and enhance compliance. Through Altana's value chain management system, Peter's work has revolutionized how governments approach border management, sanctions enforcement, and illicit goods detection. His innovative contributions have helped border security professionals navigate the complex challenges of today's interconnected world, making our global supply chains more resilient, secure, and transparent. Peter, welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Curtis. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Peter, one of the things that I wanted to sort of start with here is the idea of that as Chief Science Officer, could you walk us through the process of developing and training AI models specifically for border security and its applications, but also sort of highlight the unique challenges you've encountered in that space?
Absolutely. So we're really living through a period of two disruptions. One is the rise of modern AI systems. The second is the end of the previous era of globalization and a fragmentation of the global landscape. This implies changes, both disruptions imply changes for border security. It's obvious, I think, that fragmentation leads to more criminality, more difficulty in collaboration, et cetera. All else being equal, it makes things more difficult. On the flip side, of course, it presents the opportunity to build something better. And AI does present really the opportunity to master and manage complexity at scale in a way that was not previously available and is now very, very positive for border security agencies. So to speak to, you might imagine systems, and not just imagine, we work on and, like systems that are in place to do everything from managing at the transaction level, both what should be facilitated and what should be inspected, to the company level, who should be ANEO, authorized economic operator, who should go for more assessment, who should just have nothing done, all the way up into like understanding of networks and production of both good and bad things, facilitating the production of things like, say, vaccines and stopping the production of, say, illicit narcotics. Now, as you think about what that all relies upon fundamentally when you're working in a law enforcement context is having an underlying evidentiary basis, a source of truth, and actually being able to justify your decisions and what the AI is helping you do based around a reality that can engage in whatever sort of justification you need to carry out the action and serve the principles of justice while also benefiting from the acceleration of these tools. Secondly, you want a system that can actually allow collaboration across the different parties involved, ideally with AI helping to harmonize that. So there's so many good compliant partners, and I think product passports are a great example of this, who really want to, like in the private sector, in the public sector, everybody wants to collaborate to serve that mission of trade facilitation and economic growth. And that same evidentiary basis, which allows both targeting of illicit activity, also allows the identification at scale of what's permitted, allows the submission of evidence. So you don't have unaccountable AI systems, but actually the ability to adjudicate, to work together to get to the right outcome, and to do it in a privacy and sovereignty preserving manner. So to highlight that final challenge, and just to speak to it, of course, across the public and private sector, security, data security, privacy, and sovereignty is extremely important. Federated systems are the key here. And so when I talk about federated systems, I mean systems that keep the data in place, Just as you're, for example, on your cell phone, your text messages stay on your cell phone, except for the person you sent it to. But then simultaneously allow collaboration where appropriate, say sharing information or chart or just intelligence and shared models without moving the sensitive information. And this is so transformative because it both complies with things like GDPR and all these other types of regulation at the same time as allowing sharing of what constitutes risk. And so across both different companies, say logistics parties, governments, but also different governments collaborating with each other, it is such an enabling technology.
So really, many of the challenges are about the multiple players and layers of information that needs to be shared within that space. How did you start to engage with all of that?
You mean me personally? How did I get into this?
Well, just sort of that you personally, but also your company and how you started to think about this as a problem and finding the solution to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we started the company 7 years ago, and we thought to ourselves, globalization isn't going to last. There's an opportunity to fix globalization, to build a better global system that has these characteristics of collaboration, that doesn't have the abuses we've seen, like, say, human rights abuses, environmental degradation, all the types of crime and production and transportation of illicit goods that everyone is familiar with, but also has more efficiency, more actual, say, abundance for everybody, more production of goods, more resiliency, foodstuff security, energy security, all of that. That was sort of what motivated us. We thought this current system isn't going to last, and there is an opportunity to fix globalization and build something better. And look, I live in the real world. I'm not sort of naive about these things, but I will say it has been an amazingly exciting experience, and we've had a lot of success with that. And fundamentally, at its heart, what makes that possible is, of course, having a vision and being able to, like, that collaborative network based around a shared source of truth with all the types of abilities to focus upon what's important, AI both to construct and manage that. But it's also really, we live at this moment of transformation and the underlying technologies of what's even feasible. So this really is like living through electrification in some sense. I'll just say this personally as an engineer. It's like living through a new electrification. And what that means is a lot of things like managing the complexity of having, I don't know, you might have hundreds of millions of records you need to analyze. You might have more, you might have billions, right? That you're going to analyze in the course of your day. And then in the past, this just wasn't feasible. It's now feasible. And you have these systems that become ever more sophisticated and that can be deployed in a privacy preserving way. And so it was the confluence of both that understanding that globalization wouldn't last, the desire to make a system that was a better trading system, better production, better trade compliance and facilitation, better resiliency. And then secondly, this frankly correct belief that with AI, this was going to be possible in an ever expanding and more accelerative way.
So obviously, lots of entities that are willing to be part of this process and engage with this and understanding the importance of this, and also the changing nature of what globalization is. But in that, in these complex multi-tier supply networks, you have bad actors as well. So how does your platform identify and flag the potential illicit networks and these entities? Because they're obviously not saying, oh, please pick us as part of that ongoing network. But how is it within this that you really sort of tap into that and are able to flag these bad actors?
I hope the audience will appreciate it. I'm not going to get too deeply into the
No,
details,
no.
but I'll just note that there's both probabilistic and deterministic approaches, and both should be based on a source of truth, because then that's what actually allows for, real decision making. And so we talked earlier about that understanding of the multiple tiers of the supply chain, the understanding of the links there. When you talk about deterministic, you might just deterministically understand that across the multiple tiers, there's a connection to illicit activity. And that could be environmental degradation, that could be something else. I think you all can understand that. The second would be like probabilistic. So it's like based around learning from the history of what's occurred. Then even when there's obfuscation or things like that, you would learn what that pattern looks like. And the advantage of marrying these two systems on a source of truth is they're very adaptive. So previously, sort of the existence of criminal organizations their advantage has been they adapt more quickly. But with AI and these, then the government. But with these systems, you now have the ability to actually accelerate adaptation, and the informational advantage that government has really starts to come into play in a way that it hasn't been brought into play before. So I'm very bullish on the opportunity to achieve both that mission around trade compliance, and I'm not just including sort of smuggling. I'm also talking about things like revenue evasion, counterfeits, all of those things that I know that much of our audience are as or even more interested in, but also trade facilitation and really actually building a system that even with the more stringent requirements that we see coming down, things like EU deforestation regulation, carbon border adjustment mechanism, UFLPA, all of those things, you actually, whatever it is for your country, it is actually the ability to go through and actually satisfy that need at scale and really allow customs to be ever more, border security more generally, to be ever more central to actually helping the whole country operate.
Great, great. It's just so exciting and so interesting in terms of all of these moving parts, but also, again, this idea that it is collecting this ongoing real-time data to understand these processes. And I think this kind of brings me into my next question around, and you and I chatted about this earlier around your see, focus, and act framework.
Yeah.
And you and I talked about, I'm used to the old ODA, the observe, orient, decide, and act, but this is a much more refined approach to this. Can you sort of walk us through that framework and how you see this being applied?
Yeah, I think for those of your listeners who are familiar with the OODA loop, it's a very similar concept. Fundamentally, what we're talking about here is the ability to see what's happening at scale in a private, secure manner. And what that looks like is being able to understand the multiple tiers at scale across billions of records for the global supply chain, being able to process that, harmonize that, understand that in the context of a given country's imports or exports or whatever other types of activity you're trying to analyze. And then focusing upon what's important, because even after you harmonize all that data, you're going to have hundreds of millions of companies, hundreds of millions of links around the world. How are you going to actually decide what's important to spend your time on? AI is enormously transformative for actually identifying. We talked earlier about probabilistic systems and deterministic systems. You can use both. You can learn from the history of what's good and bad to say, hey, this looks like that, and we're doing this in an adaptive manner, both at the company or at the network or at the shipment level. But then you can also say, hey, we're looking to understand this type of pattern and go and analyze that. And because you've taken through AI, you've been able to harmonize everything. It might say all the company names in many different languages. I think your listeners all know that even that seeing what's happened is very difficult because you might have a tax identifier, but it doesn't match up with any other country's tax identifier. The foreign parties don't have any like tax IDs that match up to anyone else's. It's a nightmare, right? And then like, how does that go to corporate structures? How does that work? Being able to actually go through and actually then harmonize that is enormously transformative. AI is great at that semantic understanding all the different languages and ways to write a company or a good or what have you. And then we talked about focus there, and then act, as you sort of highlighted so well, and as we certainly feel, that's about like, now that you focus on what's important, you can reach out and say, hey, we need more information on this from like a compliant party. Or you can take an action and be like, here's a subpoena. Or you can say, oh, like we're actually going to, we want to like just understand more generally what's the economic impact of these changes. I'm a border agency. I want to like start facilitating a certain type of good, maybe around, I don't know, electronics production or semiconductors or something like that. Or I want to actually empower a resiliency initiative where we're actually going to work with our maybe our industrial ministry or our commerce ministry or whatever part of government is appropriate to actually boost production here. We need to understand what are the inputs to this, and then we need to actually have an industrial policy around this type of critical good. And so all of those things are then possible, and then the collaboration features are so key to that. And I can't stress this enough. It's like what good systems look like here is they allow collaboration between the public and private sector and different parts of the public sector. That's like about being able to go through and actually have the different departments, ministries collaborate. It's about being able to actually have them reach out and work together with the logistics companies. It's about having to be able to work together with the private sector. That is so transformative because all of a sudden you've transformed a relationship that in some cases is frankly cat and mouse into a relationship that's now about like, how do we achieve our shared goals, which are shared goals around moving the good stuff quickly, stopping the bad stuff, growing the economy.
Now, you speak about collaboration, and I think this is a critical piece because for the longest time, we've operated in silos, but using sort of this the see, focus, and act piece Has that created some aha moments for different entities that you've worked for? It's like, wait a minute, collaboration, yes, we need to do this, but this is how we understand that in a more applied and certainly rational way.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just the ability. I mean, it's funny. There's two aha moments that come right off the bat, which is like one, just being able to often remove silos even within an organization. So you've
Mm.
unified the data, it's in place. You know, it might even be within the same data set. You might have foreign parties that have all sorts of different, like I'm thinking just the customs agency case, they have all sorts of different ways to represent themselves. Now they're unified. But like more generally, you're like bringing together all these different lists or siloed part of your agency that were not previously together. You can already start to see things in that. You're like, oh, that's revenue evasion, or oh my gosh, we stop that
Mm.
party all the time and they're so compliant. Like, why are we doing that? The second step, of course, is building out those multiple tiers and that understanding. And that's another aha moment where you're like, for both like, frankly, for a machine to analyze like an AI system, but also just a human to be like, oh my gosh, like a tier back, this supply chain makes no sense. Or like this is clearly like no transformation of the good, like that's transshipment. Or like, you know what I'm saying? Like there's so many obvious ways to do that. And then finally, the ability to go through and then like actually collaborate and be like, okay, like here's where we need a country of origin certificate, or here's where we need something else. Like that's so powerful.
Yeah, no, exactly. And
All of
it's
those are aha moments, you know what I
yeah,
mean?
and it's great to sort of have a model that works through that and gives you clear stages how to think about that.
Okay.
Now, you referenced early on around globalization and the changing nature of that, and one of the reasons why you're very interested in where we're moving. So, given the recent geopolitical tensions and reshoring of efforts, how do you see global supply chains evolving, and what are the implications this has for border security worldwide?
Absolutely. So, you know, it's obvious, frankly, it's obvious to anyone who's reading the news, we're living in an era of fragmentation. And this has been something that's actually been going on for a while. So certainly, you know, the April 2nd tariffs and all of that, those are certainly reverberating around the world. But taking a step back more generally, this has been a slow march away from sort of the previous era of globalization over the past decade and a half, 2 decades, I would say. And that just comes from sort of the geopolitical realities of the world, as well as just a lot of internal domestic stressors around the world. What that means concretely is, of course, like a desire, especially from you know, like some of the industrialized nation, the deindustrialized nations to be reindustrialized, the desire for reshoring, all of those things. What that results in from a customs agency perspective or a border security perspective is really you've got increased fragmentation. You have more need for trade compliance, but at the same time, you're trying to help your industry actually survive and thrive in these turbulent waters. And so, what that looks like is how do you manage an increase in criminality, an increase in tariff evasion, an increase in all these problems at the same time as you're managing the desire and the need to actually move goods more quickly if you hope to advance in this world. And so what that looks like fundamentally is the need for the types of AI that we just talked about, or that really is the way to thrive in these difficult times. I don't want to sugarcoat it, but there is a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, and I think that that's the interesting piece is recognizing that there is an opportunity. It's not a let's blinker, it's about where is the technology that will help us transition and make this evolution workable. Um, one of the interesting things too is that when we look at these kinds of changes, um, it also brings different kinds of threats to our border agencies. And how can AI help us address those particular um, threats, and certainly from a proactive perspective?
Absolutely. So the nice thing about AI, so I think for those of you who've worked on older school risk systems or rules-based approach to risk and facilitation, I think you all know how onerous it can be, where you'll set up a program, and the moment you set up the incentives, people start to manipulate those incentives or cheat to get into the program if it's facilitation. If it's rules-based scoring, you'll find that immediately criminal organizations will adapt and those will stop being as effective. The nice thing about AI is it can both reactively and proactively adapt very, very quickly. And so There's a whole field, for example, called reinforcement learning, which is all about how do you deal with, and this is actually driven in a different way, a lot of the advances in modern, say, LLMs or things like ChatGPT. It's a very different application of it, but it's like, how do you actually adapt to a use case and quickly change and then sense out what's happening in the world, figure out and balance between looking for the things you already know to be good or bad and finding the new things. And so that balance, combined with just generally the ability of AI to adapt, to like learn from new signals, and every day, if you want, make a new slightly adapted model based around what your seizures or what your facilitations or what your false positives were, it is so powerful. And then tied to that, we talked about the source of truth. I just want, I know I'm probably becoming boring on this subject, but the reason I'm stressing it is that what that allows you to do is run different scenarios. If you just have naive AI systems that are black boxes that can't justify their results, that's problematic. We talked about it being problematic in the way of having sort of fair border security and all of, actually just being able to rely upon it, frankly, leave aside those other important regulations and requirements. But secondly, you're not able to run scenarios because you're just sort of a captive of the past. And what I mean by that is naive systems that aren't trained on a source of truth, that are just using these sort of, like they're assuming that the future will look like the past. But if the future doesn't look like the past, they fall down. But if you're able to actually have different versions of the future because you have an underlying source of truth that you can say, what if it looked this way? What if it looked that way? And then like do that at scale and actually have your systems understand that. That is a way to actually have your AI systems. I mean this very broadly writ, like both the systems that construct the source of truth, the systems that analyze it. And I hope it's clear to your listeners. I'm not just talking about like large language models or things like, I'm not just talking about ChatGPT here. I'm talking about the whole range of AI and machine learning systems that may or may not be generative. They may not be outputting text, but they're very adaptive in learning. And when learning from that source of truth, you can think about hypothetical realities and have them be adapted for that in advance. So you get, just to summarize then, you're talking faster reactivity. If you want almost instantaneous reactivity, which is a huge change, so fast that it might look like proactivity, frankly. And then secondly, the ability to actually go through and run those different scenarios and actually be truly proactive.
I'm just going to go to the Q&A because I think there's a really interesting question as it relates to sort of these shifts. And it's a reference to AI has a huge potential, but small businesses may not have the skills to be involved, linked to such a system as those in which you've developed. Now, this is an interesting part of it. Does business size matter? And are larger businesses more likely to work together inside such a system that you're describing? And again, if we're looking at changing globalization and new players in the space.
I actually think these systems really advantage small companies as well. And what I mean by that is, for me, what AI is about is simplicity through complexity. Like the AI system is what's managing the complexity, and then it's resulting in simple decisions. And that might be like assigning a harmonized system code, or it might be like helping to, you might help to value a good. You might help to make sure that you're compliant with deforestation regulation. All of those things, which previously would be the purview of just big organizations or be very costly. And instead, you're talking about distributed intelligence that allows these companies to act quite quickly. And certainly that's been our experience, is that, you're actually talking about a democratization of this type of knowledge and analysis that wasn't feasible before.
And this kind of then leads into that a little bit about looking at the long-term vision you have for how AI sort of will transform border security and the global supply management over the next decade. Like, as you said, the speed at which we're moving, that sort of forward-looking aspect of this, today is not what 10 years is going to look like. What do you see in the future? Get the crystal ball out and let us sort of glimpse into that.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm seeing, and I'll say that, like, when I think about achieving the future that we all want to move towards, of course, well, I don't know if it's of course to all your audience, but I'll say, of course, maybe these AI systems are going to get so much better. That's very, very clear. And so what you're talking about here is the ability to have ever more holistic understanding of what's happening at scale, to have really enabled collaboration between the different parties, to understand the multiple tiers of the supply chain, and then actually to have like agentic systems that are analysts that are going through and actually allowing you to, at scale, sort of scale your ability to really ask very sophisticated questions, like run the different scenarios, come to you proactively with reports, all of that. And I hope your audience here doesn't sort of worry. I mean, worry that this is like going to come and like displace everyone's jobs and border security, everything. Not. This is such a complicated field and such a difficult place that like it's AI is such an accelerant here. It's not a replacement. These are systems that can like, there are so many problems for us all to go and build out a more efficient, resilient, compliant, sustainable world. Like it's very obvious. And so what you're talking about here is an ever more holistic understanding of the multiple tiers, an ever deeper ability to collaborate without requirements on humans or a consulting bonanza, and then an ability to actually achieve your goals and expand the mission of customs. I think the second thing that's really important to note, however, is this is also like an organizational transformation to really occur. And so really to achieve these goals, certainly I could go on and I could get really geeky on all like sort of the network generative models I'm excited about, the ability to harmonize understanding of networks with understanding of language, like the way that this then translates into actually systems that are, I mean, look, they're already superhuman, their ability to read every language, their ability to analyze complexity at scale, their ability also to code it up, but are ever more reliable, are ever more intelligent in their ability here, and then aligned with what we want here. I don't want to create some sort of scary picture. But the second thing is like, there has to be an impetus to use them, to harvest these benefits and really like train everyone in how to use them, how to manage these AI systems, because in some ways it does look like a management task, and how to architect and construct this. And so I think that is, and I wouldn't presume to tell, your listeners in border security, you all are the experts, right? Like what we're talking about here is like, it's a collaborative thing to figure out together. But the question I would pose is like, if you have, and you do have this ability now to have these secure, private, compliant systems that can analyze supply chains at scale, that can flexibly adjust to changing patterns of good and bad behavior, that can help with resiliency, how are you actually going to deploy that out? What organizational transformations need to be in place? What are you worried about? What else needs to be done? And I would ask for those things, and they can be achieved.
Yeah, and I think this is a really interesting point because in a number of the other areas that I work in, this idea of using AI as a productive tool, it is not a sort of a mechanism to move people out of the workforce. It's about enabling them to do many more things that they weren't able to do at this moment. But it also goes back to the idea of what are the skills that we need to start developing for implementing these changes in global governance in these issues related to security and trade.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's, the tools are in our hands. The question is how to use them.
Right, right. So it's about giving them the opportunity to utilize these tools, learn about what this is in terms of a capacity building, productivity, and also going back to the idea, the see, focus, and act. It gives you an opportunity to use this in a more robust and effective way.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, listen, this has been remarkable. We've come to the end of our time for sure, and I just want to thank you for taking this time, being frank and engaging with the conversation. And I know we could go on for many more hours on this conversation as well. But again, thank you so much, Peter. I really appreciate your time. And I know that our listeners will have also appreciated the ability to share this information with you. I'd also like to thank our folks at the Borders and Globalization Lab for sponsoring this seminar series. And if you'd like to learn anything more about borders and globalization, please go to www.bigglobalization.org and tap into their incredible wealth of knowledge and the events that are coming up over the next number of months. Again, Peter, thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, and thank you, folks, for joining us for this last 30 minutes. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Curtis. Thank you, team. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.